Hello again, everyone. Welcome to part 4 of the St. Vitus Lenten series on the Gospels. Today is our final session as we finish with, last but not least, what I refer to as the fan-favorite Gospel of John. For me personally, although the Gospel traditionally bears my same name, it's actually my least favorite Gospel. When I began studying John's Gospel in college, I wasn't a fan how different it was from the Synoptics, and I also wasn't a fan of how the Gospel was used to promote anti-Semitism throughout the centuries. However, my opinions have changed since then as I began to appreciate that John's Gospel was more concerned about theology and meaning rather than my more literal interpretation in college. As I began understanding this more in light of John's community, I realized that there is a lot to unpack here and much to appreciate as a result. As I discovered, although the Gospel of John is often the most popular gospel by Christians, it's arguably the most misunderstood of the four. It has a much more sophisticated and elevated theology, moreover. And most detrimentally, it has been the most used gospel to support anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic tendencies that encouraged cultural discrimination of Jews throughout the centuries. However, when you read John's Gospel with a first-century context, all hatred toward the Jewish people is completely false and untrue due to the fact that this anti-Jewish feeling comes straight from the Jewish Christians being kicked out of the synagogues in 95 AD. As a result, being officially kicked out of Judaism is what created this feeling of betrayal that is in the background of the Gospel as a whole. So it's my argument that although the Gospel does explicitly seem to put the Jews at fault in certain parts of the story, the writer and community know full well that the Jews as a people were not responsible for killing Jesus. Before we get to the crux of this issue, let's review what we have learned about John's Gospel so far. First, the Gospel of John was written around the year 100 AD, following the Jewish Christians being kicked out of the synagogues, as well as the Jews formalizing their scripture at the Council of Jamnia in 95 AD as a direct reaction to the Jewish Christian belief in Jesus as the Messiah. As a result, it was written for a Jewish Christian community who is probably located outside of Palestine. Very early on and into the present day, John was quite fittingly nicknamed the Spiritual Gospel due to the level of theology being so different from the Synoptics. Which we can also note that although John knew of those three Gospels, they are not used as any of John's sources. Because of this context of Jewish Christians being officially kicked out of Judaism, since, as we know, the Jesus movement was originally part of Judaism, it's arguably the most anti-Jewish gospel. Furthermore, it's the second longest written gospel of the four, and it is famously most well known for what I refer to as the I am sayings, like, I am the bread of life, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the vine, you are the branches, and I am the resurrection and the life. None of these I am sayings are in any of the Synoptic Gospels and is therefore completely unique to John's Gospel. In fact, Jesus rarely talks about himself at all in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. However, since John's Gospel is nicknamed the Spiritual Gospel, it is very clear that the Gospel is more concerned about theology than history. I might add that none of the four Gospels are literally history textbooks in the modern sense. And if they were, then we'd have to deal with many apparent contradictions that arguably none of the Gospel writers would have actually been concerned with. But for John's community, they tell you who Jesus is to them. Jesus is the way, the truth, the resurrection, the life, the vine, and the branches. It's the ultimate loving relationship to a community who sees Jesus as the only way to God. That's what the gospel tells us through Jesus' I am sayings. And it's what they believe about Jesus in their own lives. This is why it's known as the Spiritual Gospel. As we move on to accounts in John's Gospel, it's worth noting one characteristic that is absent in John's Gospel, which is an infancy narrative, which, as we know, is only in Matthew and Luke. However, even though John's gospel doesn't begin with the beginning of Jesus, i.e. his birth, John begins, rather, with the beginning of time. John talks about Jesus as the Word made flesh, using the Greek word logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And the Word became flesh, and is dwelling among us. And we saw his glory, the glory as of the God's only Son, full of grace and truth. John's use of the Greek word logos has direct parallels to the Greek word Sophia, or wisdom, from the Jewish Testament. Specifically, I will be talking about from the book of Proverbs. The Lord created me at the beginning of God's work, the first of God's act long ago. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth. When God established the heavens, I was there. When God made firm the skies above, when God established the fountains of the deep, when God marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was beside the Lord like a master worker, and I was daily God's delight, rejoicing before the Lord always. Happy is the one who listens to me, forever finds me, finds life, and obtains favor from the Lord. Now, the first question many theologians ask is why John didn't use the word Sophia rather than logos, since the word logos is in the Jewish Testament. We obviously don't know the answer of this question, despite the fact that many might speculate that one word is female in gender, Sophia, and the other male, logos. However, as we know in Slovenian, gender doesn't always correlate directly to a word, like the Slovenian word dekle, which is actually neuter in gender. However, in Jewish history, often the two words are used interchangeably. The only difference in meaning is that wisdom, or Sophia, is internal to a person, while the word logos is reason that gets expressed verbally. However, as Catholics, it would be fitting to note that wisdom, or Sophia, is associated most directly with the Holy Spirit, while the word, or logos, is associated with Jesus. Whether John's Gospel is addressing it in this same way, however, we'll never know for sure. What we do know for sure, moreover, is that John's beginning sets the tone quite differently than the other three, especially giving a level of theological sophistication that is on a whole different level. Yet another reason why John is nicknamed the spiritual gospel. Now that we've talked about John's unique prologue to the gospel, let's talk about four similar accounts that are in almost all the gospels. First, John's account of Jesus' baptism actually avoids his being baptized altogether. Rather, it talks about John the Baptist witnessing the Spirit coming down like a dove when he meets Jesus. He also talks about Jesus being the one ahead of him, and that he would baptize with the Spirit. In other words, John testifies that Jesus is the Son of God. As we all may remember, the Spirit descending occurs after Jesus' baptism, thus showing how John completely omits the baptism and further avoids the problem of the synoptics, i.e. the appearance of John's being superior to Jesus. Furthermore, the gospel makes sure to have John say that Jesus is superior to him prior to the Spirit descending like a dove. Next, let's recall that we remember Jesus goes into the desert to fast for 40 days and be tempted by Satan. However, in John's Gospel, this story isn't there at all. So, not much else we can say there. Now, as we've done before, let's skip to the death and resurrection of Jesus, although taking time to read the Gospel on your own and keeping in mind the context and characteristics of John's Gospel should help bring you a new perspective. But in terms of the death of Jesus, we see a more divine Jesus who's in complete control of his death, especially when you compare it to Mark's gospel. Specifically, it starts with Jesus being taken at the Garden of Gethsemane by Judas, soldiers, and guards, who immediately fall to the ground when Jesus says the words, "I am he." He is in control of the situation and is merely doing what is foretold in the scriptures. It would be fitting to note that the soldiers and guards were sent by the Pharisees, who were the main enemies of the Jewish Christians when the gospel was written. They took power following the temple's destruction and were often the ones running the synagogues. So they were arguably the leaders who officially kicked the Jewish Christians out of Judaism altogether. So naturally, John's gospel is going to take issue with them leading up to Jesus' death, as well as the gospel in its entirety. Up until Jesus being tried by Pilate, the pronoun they is used, which the reader would rightly infer as the Pharisees and everyone associated with them, i.e. soldiers, guards, and even Judas. Note, however, that the Sanhedrin isn't really mentioned here, but is mentioned prominently in Mark, Matthew, and Luke as the ones to blame for Jesus' death. However, almost out of nowhere, the Jews get referenced with Pilate when they say, "We have no right to execute anyone." Although it might be fitting to note that the Jews could put anyone to death by stoning, but only the Romans could put Jesus to death on the cross. Next, Pilate goes out to the Jews and offers the release of Jesus or Barabbas, and the Jews choose Barabbas on their own. But Pilate wants to release him. But the Jews insist that Jesus must die, and that if Pilate doesn't put him to death, then he is no longer a friend of Caesar. However, historically, as we discussed before, Pilate was forced to come into Jerusalem during Passover due to the massive number of Jews coming to the area. And he must quell any resistance that naturally came with Passover every year. So, regardless of what actually happened, the writer and community are clearly pointing out how they are feeling in the present moment with the Jews and Pharisees who kicked them out of Judaism altogether. They are extremely upset and unhappy with them, and let the Jews know how unhappy they are with how they wrote the story. However, throughout all of this, Jesus is in control of the situation completely. And after all was fulfilled, Jesus says the words, "It is finished," and simply bows his head and dies. What we should note here is that this account is extremely different than the other three Gospels. And the differences continue into Jesus' resurrection. Similar to the other Gospels, Mary Magdalene is the first to go to the tomb and finds it empty. She in turn runs to Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, and they both in turn run to the tomb. John gets there first, indicating that the community believed him to be superior to Peter. Afterwards, Mary stays at the tomb weeping, and Jesus appears to her, but she thinks he's a gardener until he says, "Mary." She then replies with the word rabbi or Rabboni. Jesus then appears to the disciples, except Thomas, despite the fact that the doors are locked. He then appears to Thomas later saying, "Blessed are those who have not seen but believed." This seems to point out that the Jewish Christians never saw Jesus in the year 95, but they still believed. Whereas the Jews who kicked them out didn't believe. So any Jewish Christian or Jew reading this in context would probably get the symbolism that John's Gospel is making. Next, Jesus appears to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and they eat fish for breakfast with him. Jesus then asks Peter if he loves him 3 times, which reverses his 3 denials. Finally, since the Gospel was written for a Johannine community, the Gospel closes with talking about how the disciple whom Jesus loved would not die or be martyred. As we can see by understanding the context surrounding John's Gospel, it's very clear that the Jewish Christians' feeling of betrayal at essentially being kicked out of Judaism when the Pharisees, in turn, kicked them out of the synagogues, is what's on their mind when they put the Jews at fault for killing Jesus. As a result, Christians over the centuries began taking John's Gospel literally, setting off a chain of events that would affect history forever, ultimately being used as justification to persecute the Jews over the centuries. But in reality, John's community most likely knew that the Jews, as an entire people, did not literally band together in killing Jesus via the cross. Rather, the community is essentially lashing out on account of feeling so betrayed by the Jewish friends and potentially their own family as well. Now imagine what it would have been like to be essentially excommunicated from the religion you grew up in and was a part of, and therefore your whole identity. You would quite understandably feel angry and betrayed. Furthermore, since the Gospel's focus is more on theology than history, especially since the first century world was less literalistic and focused more on a story's meaning, it would probably never occur to the writer, and by extension the community, that Christians would eventually take the story literally in thinking that the Jews would band together as a people and kill Jesus. Moreover, they knew better than we did that no one could get crucified unless Rome initiated it. And any insurrection around Passover was immediately crushed, no matter how big or how small. That was just what was characteristic of the age of the Pax Romana, or the Peace of Rome. The Romans achieved peace through victory, or better known as killing anyone who disturbed the peace, so to speak, by essentially getting in Rome's way. Finally, it's ignoring the first century context that proved to be disastrous to the Jewish people. But furthermore, ignoring context can, as I've said before, enable one to get the Bible to say literally whatever you want it to say. As a result, misreading the Bible can even go so far as contributing to events like World War II. And it was most certainly used for this type of justification. This is why we need to understand context more than ever. So the Bible can't be misused, whether on a small scale or on a larger scale. As I've said before, I will continue to say it and say it again. This is indeed why context matters.